I found to be profound. And two of those statements are centered around jet fuel or jet propulsion fuel, what we abbreviate as JP8 or simply jet fuel. And the first one says that the militaries of the US and other NATO countries consume 5 billion gallons of jet fuel per year. So that's a lot of fuel consumption. And one can imagine that in years where the military is even more active, there's more consumption of fuel. And this leads to the second statement, which is that jet fuel is the single most frequent chemical exposure for military personnel. The single most frequent chemical exposure for military personnel. Now, I found that to be particularly profound because we do know that jet fuel is toxic. So for instance, jet fuel can affect the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system, the endocrine system, the kidney, the lungs, the liver, etc. There's so many systems throughout the body that can be affected by jet fuel exposure. So the notion that this is the single most frequent chemical exposure for military personnel just seems profound to me. The other statement that I want to share with you is centered around noise exposure. Now, this I find to be interesting. This statement says that almost every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine will be exposed to hazardous levels of noise at some point in his or her military career. Hazardous levels of noise are noise levels that are so loud that it causes hearing loss. And this actually makes sense because if we look at veterans, hearing loss is actually the most prevalent service-related disability. In other words, more veterans have hearing loss than any other condition that you can think of. So I find this to be very interesting, and it demonstrates how pervasive and how potent noise exposure is in the military. Now, jet fuel by itself is a toxin, and noise exposure by itself is a toxin. But what about the exposure, the combined exposure of both of them? And the reason why combined exposure is relevant is because usually in areas that are polluted with the fumes of jet fuel, there is also some level of noise, such as working around jets or other vehicles that utilize jet fuel. There's always noise. But we don't normally think about the interaction between noise and jet fuel, although they both exist in the same environment. One example is that in the military, there are regulations regarding the amount of jet fuel that you can be exposed to. And we even have federal laws regarding noise exposure in the workplace. But there are no laws or regulations regarding combined exposure. And I find that even in the research arena, there's very little thought to the combined exposure. Now, there is one group that published the first research on combined exposure to jet fuel and noise. And this is from a group where they evaluated medical records of individuals who work in the military, but their work is such that they are naturally exposed to noise and jet fuel. And what they did in this particular study is by evaluating those medical records, they were able to identify certain correlations or associations. And these correlations or associations led them to the conclusion that when jet fuel is combined with hazardous noise, it causes hearing loss. Now, there's several things that bother me about this, and one is that it's not entirely convincing to me that that's the case, because maybe the hearing loss was caused by just the noise and the fuel had nothing to do with it. And also, it's too associational or too correlational. What's needed here is what's needed is an actual experiment. And this particular experiment that I'm going to share with you was done by Larry Fechner, who's actually part of our group. And what Larry did was he evaluated whether or not when you add noise and jet fuel together, if that would exacerbate an existing hearing loss. In other words, what he did was took a group of animals and exposed them to noise, and then that noise produced a small hearing loss. But then he got another group of animals, exposed them to the same noise, but this time added jet fuel, and what he found was a significant or severe hearing loss, suggesting that the jet fuel actually enhanced the hearing loss from the noise. So in this figure that you're looking at here, on this axis, it's showing you auditory function. And on this axis down here, it's showing you auditory function as it relates to low pitch sounds, mid pitch sounds, and high pitch sounds. So what he has done is he took a group of animals, and at baseline, he measured their auditory function. By baseline, I mean before the beginning of the study. So at the beginning of the study, before he manipulates any variables or expose the animals, he simply measures auditory function. And what he recorded was a robust, nice response. So that's the responses in black. Then he exposed the animals to a hazardous noise, a noise that will cause hearing loss. And then he does the same recording again after the noise. And here he's recording 1 week after the noise and 4 weeks after the noise. And indeed, you can see a difference. So before the noise exposure, you had this robust response. And then after the noise exposure, now the response is suppressed. So that suggests to us that the hearing function of the animals was suppressed due to the noise exposure. Then the next step, or the next procedure that he did, was simply to add jet fuel to the experimental paradigm. And by adding jet fuel, so now he's looking at the combination of jet fuel and noise, what he found was that the hearing loss basically became more severe. Okay, so that suggests to us that fuel exposure may increase noise damage, leading to more hearing loss. So this was very significant work that he did. Now, Larry ultimately retired, and I kind of took over for him. And I wanted to focus on the brain. And my ultimate hypothesis was that, I think the brain is going to be much more vulnerable than the ear. So yes, I agree that combined exposure to jet fuel and noise will result in hearing loss. But I think hearing loss is more of a late stage toxicity. In other words, the brain is probably affected first, and then later on, the ear becomes affected. And so what I did was design some experiments, and indeed, we published those experiments. Here are some of those publications. We have publications coming out even now about this work, and there's several coming in the future as well. So what I want to do is just set up first the experimental design. So what exactly did we do? So in our experimental design, we are using animals, and we have to use animals because it's unethical for us to expose human beings in such a way and with toxins that we know will cause harm to them. So we have to use animals. And in this case, we're using a particular strain of rat called a Long Evans rat. And we divide these rats, we randomly divide these rats into 4 experimental groups. The first group is a group that receives just jet fuel. Now, unlike other studies, the jet fuel level that we're using is actually considered to be safe. So we're using a very small or low dose of jet fuel, and this is considered to be safe. Another group of animals receive just noise, and the noise that we're using is noise that's considered to be legally safe as well. So this group only gets noise, and the noise is considered to be a mild noise or a noise that is safe. Then another group, or the third group, receives both jet fuel, the safe jet fuel, combined with the safe noise. And there, what we want to see is if we take 2 things that are supposed to be safe and we put them together, are they still safe? Okay. And then the last group is just a control group, and the control group simply receives no treatment. Okay. Now, whenever we do an experiment and we get a result, that result leads us to a conclusion. And whenever we get any result and conclusion, we always want to verify it. So we redo the study. And sometimes what we do is not only do we redo the study, but we change even the personnel. We get different technicians, different everything, and we just redo the study. So in this case, we did the exact same thing. So not only did we redo the study, but we changed the strain of animals that we were studying. So instead of a Long Evans rat, we're using now a Fisher 344 rat. And if our results are stable and true, then we would expect the results to generalize across animal strains, right? Not only do we redo the study in different strains of animals, but if we started with males, we verify that the results generalize to females. And if we start with females, we verify that the results generalize across to males. So by doing these verifications, it allows us to stand behind the results that we get. It makes us feel confident in our conclusions. One last methodological thing that I'll share with you is when we do our jet fuel exposures, we actually measure the chemical composition of the jet fuel, and we do that so that we're assured that what the animals are actually inhaling is what we expect, the actual jet fuel that we expect. We also know that it's real jet fuel because we actually got the jet fuel from the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So it's the exact same jet fuel that goes into jets. But nonetheless, we measured chemical composition to ensure that the fuel contains the exact chemical species that we know jet fuel should have. And we do that in real time. So as the animals are inhaling it, it's being measured. So this is the general research design that we'll use. So remember, the hypothesis is that we think that the brain is going to be much more vulnerable than the ear. And in order for us to show that, what we want to do is use safe levels of noise and safe levels of jet fuel. And by safe, I mean that they don't cause any other problems. So the noise doesn't cause hearing loss. The jet fuel doesn't cause any other problems, because we want to show that the brain is actually much more vulnerable. So therefore, at lower levels that are safe, the brain is going to show a pathology. Now, And what I'm doing here is I'm going to take you back to basic college level anatomy here, or even high school biology, and remind you about the ear and the brain. So this particular cartoon that you're looking at is showing you a coronal section through the ear and the brain. And this structure here might look familiar to you. It's the most visible part of the ear. Ultimately, sounds get collected here, and it goes through to the middle part of the ear. Then it goes to the inner part of the ear, or the cochlea. This is also called the organ of hearing. Once the organ of hearing processes the sound, it then sends the sound via the auditory nerve to the brainstem, right? This entire structure here is the brainstem. The brainstem processes the sound and ultimately send that sound to the cortex. And that's how you know that you heard something, okay? So what we're going to do is evaluate this entire pathway step by step to figure out if indeed the brain and where in the brain is more susceptible or vulnerable relative to the ear. Okay, so let's start with the cochlea, the organ of hearing. And what we're going to do is measure the activity or the function of the cells within that cochlea in order for us to figure out whether or not it's being damaged by the exposures, the fuel or the noise, or the fuel plus noise. So the first measure is this emissions threshold measure. And what this is measuring is how sensitive are the cells within the cochlea. And we're stimulating those cells with different pitches or frequencies. So here you have low pitch, mid pitch, and high pitch or frequencies. And what we found is that regardless of the exposure, whether it's noise exposure, fuel exposure, or fuel plus noise exposure, it had no significant effect on the sensitivity of the cells within the cochlea. Now, these cells are important because if they're damaged, you'll develop a hearing loss. So this is telling us that the sensitivity of those cells is pretty much intact. To verify this result, we did another measure, which then looked at how responsive those cells are. And when we did that, we can see that there's no significant difference between the groups. So again, it verified that the cells within the cochlea are sensitive and they're responsive. They're not damaged by the exposures. Now, because those cells in the cochlea are responsible for hearing, if they are damaged, it will result in hearing loss. So one of the things that we looked at is just the thresholds of the animals. So how sensitive is the animal to sound, or what's the lowest level of sound that the animal can detect? And when we looked across the exposure groups or the experimental groups, we don't see any significant difference, which again tells us that the hearing apparatus or the cochlea is normal. Okay, and what we're measuring here is how the animals are hearing a click sound. A click sound is a sound that has multiple frequencies. So we verified that again by doing another measure. And in this measure, what we're doing is, instead of looking at multiple frequencies at once, we're looking at individual discrete frequencies. And again, we find that the hearing sensitivity of the animal, the cochlea in general, is functioning normally, regardless of the exposures. So what that told us is that our experimental setup, by using a safe level of fluid, safe levels of noise, and when we combine them, we could not detect any functional or physiological deficit associated with the cochlea. So then the next step is to simply open the cochlea and take a direct look at the cells within the cochlea, just to make sure that we didn't miss anything, okay? So this particular photomicrograph is showing you just that. So this is showing you the individual cells within the actual organ. And if you don't spend every day looking at these things, it can be difficult to make sense of it. So I'm just going to walk you through one or two features. So first, do you notice that there's a row of individual cells here? So for instance, here's one cell, here's another cell, here's another cell. So it's just a row of cells that go all the way down. We usually call that row 1. And here is another row, row 2 of cells. You can see them very nicely here. And then here's another row, row 3. Now these are sensory cells. They're hair cells. So they detect sound and then process that sound and send that sound off to the nerve fibers. So if those cells are missing, then what happens is you ultimately have a hearing loss. So what we want to do here is count each of these cells to ensure that no cells are missing. And that's exactly what we did. We simply count all the cells. So for instance, in the control group, we counted the cells within the cochlea. And what we have here is just the amount, the percent of cells that are present. And we count the cells as a function of distance along the organ itself. And when we do that under normal conditions, we don't see many missing or dead cells. Basically, the cells are pretty much there at 100%. Now, after the noise exposure, we did the same thing. And indeed, we found that the noise exposure did not kill the cells. After fuel exposure, same result. And after fuel plus noise exposure, same result. So that, again, confirms what we saw with the physiological data. The physiological data told us that our exposures did not cause a hearing loss. And now this anatomical data is confirming that by demonstrating that indeed the cells are all there and healthy. So both the anatomy and physiology of the cochlea were not affected by the exposures. Okay, so what we've done so far is rule out any damage associated with the actual organ of hearing or the cochlea. The next step is to then take a look at this nerve. So notice that there's a nerve that connects the cochlea, the organ of hearing, to the brain. So we want to evaluate now this nerve to make sure that it is either normal or abnormal based on the exposures. But not only the nerve, we also want to evaluate the entire brainstem, which is this structure here. So we're going to do both of those at the same time. We're going to evaluate the nerve and evaluate the brainstem to identify where a lesion exists or a dysfunction exists, if it exists. Okay. So one interesting way that one can do this is to do what's called an auditory brainstem response. Now, an auditory brainstem response is simply electrical activity that is measured from the auditory nerve and electrical activity that's measured from different areas of the brainstem. Now, here is an example of that auditory brainstem response. Notice that it has these waves. So here's one wave, and we call that wave 1. Here's another wave, we call that wave 2. Another one we call wave 3, and so on. Now, this first wave, it's called a compound action potential. That's another name for it. And the reason why I'm pointing this one out is because this particular wave represents electrical activity that is only generated by the nerve. Okay? Therefore, if the nerve was damaged, then what we would find is that this particular wave would be absent, or it would be very small. Okay? Now these other waves, wave 2, wave 3, etc., they are from the brainstem. And if the brainstem was damaged by the noise, or the brainstem was damaged by jet fuel, then what we would find is that these particular waves, waves 1 and wave 2, wave 3, etc., wave 2, wave 3, wave 4, etc., would be eliminated, or they would be extremely small. Okay. Now, in this example, what we're looking at is the actual auditory brainstem response averaged across the control group, and the control group would be in black. So this is what normal is supposed to look like. And then red would be is the average auditory brainstem response from the fuel plus noise group, the group that received both the fuel and the noise. Now, there are two very interesting things to note here. One, notice what happens here at what's happening here at wave 1. Notice that both the control group and the noise group have pretty much identical or similar wave 1, which tells us that the auditory nerve is operating or functioning just like it should. In other words, the fuel and noise exposure did not affect the auditory nerve. But notice something else. Remember that wave 2 and wave 3, the other waves, represent the activity of the brainstem. Notice that after fuel plus noise exposure, the brainstem response is significantly truncated. In other words, the brainstem response should be like this. It should be very high, big, robust response. But after fuel and noise exposure, it's a very minuscule response. Okay, so that suggests to us that the fuel and noise exposure did not affect the auditory nerve, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, but it affected the brainstem, which is part of the central nervous system. Now we can quantify this, and if we quantify this, in this example, what we have here is change relative to the control, or change relative to normal. And here we have the different waves. So this is wave 1, which is the response from the nerve. And these other waves, waves 2 and 3, are responses or electrical activity that's generated from the brainstem. There are two measures that we're looking at here. One is amplitude, which is in black. Amplitude is just how much response we measured from either the nerve or the brainstem. And then latency is another measure. Latency is how fast the response was. Now, if we look at latency, there is no change in latency. Latency seems pretty stable. So there's nothing happening in terms of how fast the brainstem and the cochlear nerve are responding. But if we were to look at amplitude, which is the magnitude of the response, we see that for wave 1, which represents activity, neural activity from the cochlear nerve, there's no difference between fuel exposure fuel exposure and control. But when we look at the response or the activity from the brainstem, we see that there's almost a 50% lower response in the brainstem. Again, confirming what we saw here. Okay. Now, remember, there are other groups that we have. So another group that we have is the fuel group, and this is the group that only receives fuel. And in that group, we see something similar, but it's not as dramatic as when noise and fuel are combined. Okay. And remember, there's another group, which is the noise group. And in the noise group, there's just no effect. So noise had no effect on the brainstem. But fuel had a mild effect. Jet fuel had a mild effect. And when jet fuel is combined with noise, we do see a significant effect, and that effect seems to be localized to the brainstem. Okay. So this leads us to this conclusion. Safe fuel levels combined with safe noise levels are actually not safe. It may not cause a hearing loss, but it is affecting the function of the brainstem. Okay. So far what we've done is we've used an experimental paradigm where we rely on safe levels of noise, safe levels of jet fuel, then we combine those two to see if they're actually safe. And we found that they are safe in terms of the ear. In other words, it did not cause damage to the cochlea, and it did not cause damage to the auditory nerve. But we did see a significant effect associated with how the brainstem, which is this entire area here, how the brainstem is processing sound. So the next step is we want to now look at this entire area here, the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so the brainstem needs to ultimately send the sound information to the auditory cortex. So the next step is to measure the auditory cortex and this entire area here. To make it easy, we're just going to call this entire area the cortex. Right? The cortex is actually this grayed area here, but just to make everything easy, we're going to say the cortex. So the next thing is to look at the cortex to see how the cortex is operating. In order to do that, the next technique is what's called a slow vertex potential. And it simply allows us to evaluate the integrity of the cortex. And the first measure is where we look at how fast the cortex is responding to a stimulus. And in this particular figure, this axis has time, or how fast, or the speed in which the cortex responds to a particular stimulus. And here we have different stimuli. We have low-level stimuli, and we have mid-level stimuli and high-level stimuli. And here we're only looking at two groups. So the black circles represent data from the control group. So the cortex, under normal conditions, this tells you the speed at which it will respond to these types of stimuli. Now, after noise exposure, which is represented in the squares, we see that there's some difference, but in reality, that difference is not statistically significant. So therefore, it's not a meaningful, we don't consider this to be a meaningful difference, right? So this tells us that the noise by itself did not affect how fast the cortex processes stimuli. This next figure, now we're looking at the fuel group compared to the control group. And the fuel by itself also did not show anything significantly different here. So then the next step would be to look at combined fuel plus noise. Now, when we look at fuel plus noise, we do see a statistically significant effect. And here, what the data is telling us is that with fuel plus noise exposure, the brain is significantly slow in its response. And this slowed response is consistent regardless of low-level stimuli or high-level stimuli. We do see a statistically significant difference in the response, where the brain is simply slow to respond to stimulation. Now, to verify some of this, we don't just want to look at how fast the cortex is responding, but we also want to look at the magnitude of the response. And so in this particular figure, you have the magnitude of the response highlighted here, and then here we have the same stimulus or stimuli that we've been using. And what we can see is that under normal conditions, the control group, if there is a small or low stimulus, the brain gives us a small or low response. And if there is a high stimulus, the brain gives us a higher response. That's what a normal brain would do. But in the case of fuel plus noise exposure, what we see is a suppressed, a depleted response, which tells us that the responsiveness of the brain is subdued or reduced after fuel plus noise exposure. Okay, so just to summarize some of the neurobiologic deficits that we found in the animal work, this summarizes some of what I showed you today, but we have other data that we've published that I haven't that I didn't go over today. But there's a few interesting points. One is that when you're exposed to safe levels, what's considered safe levels of jet fuel, or you're exposed to safe levels of jet fuel and safe levels of noise, it doesn't seem to affect hearing sensitivity. In other words, the animals could hear pretty well. The cochlea was just fine. But what we did find are two major outcomes. One is associated with the brainstem, and the others are associated with the cortex. And in this particular cartoon, the outcomes that we found are above this line. The outcomes that we found for the brainstem are above this line. So these are the pathological outcomes that we discovered for the brainstem. And below this line are the pathological outcomes that we discovered for the cortex. Okay, so that's the general summary of what we found, was that hearing sensitivity is normal, but it seems like there are several pathologies associated with the brainstem and several pathologies associated with the cortex. So that's all nice, and that's for animals. But what about humans? How does this translate to humans? Well, it turns out that we've been thinking about this, and we just finished a pilot study looking at human beings. Now, we can't deliberately expose human beings to conditions that we know are toxic. So what we have to do is look for opportunities. And it turns out that in the military, there are lots of people who are exposed to jet fuel naturally because of their job. And wherever there's jet fuel, there is noise. So what we've done is taken advantage of that opportunity. And this is this work, we just finished this work, so we haven't done all the analysis yet. But what I'll do is share with you some of the data that we collected. So first of all, the research was done at the Navy Hospital in San Diego. And here what we've done is recruited 48 age and sex matched participants. And from this 48, 24 of them were military personnel who were exposed to jet fuel and noise, and they're naturally exposed because of their job. The remaining 24 were exposed to only noise. Okay. Now, one interesting thing is all these participants who were exposed to noise and noise plus jet fuel, they all had normal hearing, which is very interesting because that's what we found with the animals as well. And by them having normal hearing, it allowed us to rule that out. So now we can focus on how the brain is actually functioning. And in all the measures that we measured, and I'll show you some of the measures, what happened was the group of military personnel who were exposed to both jet fuel and noise, they consistently performed worse on all the measures that we evaluated. And here are some of those measures. There's several more, but here are some. So one measure was speech in noise, or speech in quiet. And this is where we're trying to, this is where we measure how much of speech would a person understand in a quiet environment. Okay, and it turns out that those who are exposed to fuel and noise, they found it very difficult to actually process speech, understand speech in quiet situations. So we're not measuring hearing here. What we're measuring is once you hear it, how much of it do you understand? How much of it do you comprehend? When you're asked a question, are you saying no and you should be saying yes? How much can you make sense of? The next measure is speech in noise. So this time we're trying to understand how much they can understand when there's speech combined with a little bit of background noise, right? So this would be similar to if you're at a cocktail party and you're trying to talk to someone and there's noise around, or you're at a restaurant and you're trying to talk to someone in front of you, but there's restaurant noise around. Can you actually understand what the person is saying if there's noise around? And here again, the participants, the group who were exposed to both jet fuel and noise, they had significant problems with that. The next measure that we looked at is called sound localization. And this is measuring their ability to identify where in space a sound is coming from. So if you heard a sound, where is the sound? Where in space is the sound? And this was particularly interesting because here again, the group that was exposed to jet fuel and noise found it difficult to identify where in space a sound was coming from. The other measure is sound discrimination. If you heard two sounds, can you tell that they're different? Okay, so the ability to discriminate what you hear. And here again, the group that was exposed to both fuel and noise were not able to discriminate sounds. Now, all these measures that our experimental group failed at are not associated with hearing per se, because they all have normal hearing. Everyone in the cohort had normal hearing. What we're actually measuring is not how you hear, but what you do with what you hear. So once you've heard it, how does the brain process that information? In other words, all these features, these 4 features, are associated with how the brain functions, not necessarily the ear. Okay? So that leaves us with some conclusions. Number 1, exposure to jet fuel and noise may result in central nervous system dysfunctions. And the only way we can, and the interesting way that we found that was that we actually started off with what's considered to be safe noise and what's considered to be safe fuel exposure. And it turns out that it's actually not safe because it causes a central nervous system dysfunction. It didn't cause a hearing loss, but it caused a central nervous system dysfunction. And we saw that at the brainstem level, and we saw that higher at the cortical level as well. And then the last conclusion is just that what is currently considered safe is actually not safe. And this has implications for not just state and federal regulations, but also in the military as well, because the levels that are considered safe, we dropped below that. And still we were able to find some toxicity. So with that, I'm going to end and see if you have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Guthrie. That was a wonderful talk that you gave. It looks like we have a couple questions coming in, and so I'll start reading those off to you. So the first one is, do commercial air passengers have exposure to jet fuel?
Yes, indeed. In fact, this has happened to me, so I'm sure it probably has happened to you, where I'm sitting on the plane while they're fueling the plane, and I can smell the jet fuel. I can see that they're fueling the plane, but I can also smell it. So yes, when you're on the plane and you see them fueling the plane, you are getting exposure to jet fuel.
Sweet. So, well, not good, but good to know, I guess. So another question is, how does age or age-related hearing loss affect your findings? Would other individuals have a more severe deficit from safe levels of jet fuel and noise exposure?
Was that two questions or one?
I think so. So the first part is...
So let me answer the first part and then read the second part later. So the first part was, how does age-related hearing loss affect the results? So age-related hearing, so in this study, no one had any hearing loss. So in the animal study, the animals didn't have any hearing loss. In the human study, the humans didn't have any hearing loss. So age-related hearing loss has no bearing here, or any other hearing loss have no bearing here. What was the last part of that question?
Would other individuals have a more severe deficit from safe levels of jet fuel in noise exposure? So I think that's kind of related to the first part of the question.
Would other individuals? I don't know what other mean, but
yeah,
yeah, I'm not sure what other means.
Well, we'll let that attendee maybe clarify that question and then we can come back to it.
Sure.
That sounds good. So we have another question, and I think this would be a good one to ask before we get to some of the others, is how is this jet fuel exposure measured?
So the jet fuel is, we use sensitive instrumentation inside the actual chamber that the animals are in, and we sample the air continuously as the animals are inhaling the fuel.
Okay, that makes sense. And another question is, can you recover from this dysfunction if you are exposed to both jet fuel and noise?
So one of the interesting things that we looked at with these animals is we looked at long-term effects. So we're actually measuring long-term effects, and we didn't see any recovery occurring. Doesn't mean that, you know, there's individual or biological variation, so individuals may show different rates of recovery, but this seemed to be permanent. Even in the human studies, we noticed that folks who have been exposed for years are showing those deficits. So it suggests that for some individuals, it might actually be very permanent.
Okay. So we got a edit to that first question where we weren't sure. So they edited to, would older adults, say 65 or 75 years old, have a more severe deficit from the safe levels of jet fuel and noise exposure, given that older adults have processing deficits?
Yeah, that makes some sense. I would agree with that. I think what you're doing is compounding one bad situation on top of another bad situation. So I could see where the vulnerability would increase for older individuals. Sure.
Another question is, the Navajo Nation is under a jet stream which airlines use 24 hours a day with many planes. Is that considered a safe level?
Now those jets, they release fuel in the air, and that fuel actually comes down, and that is very toxic as well. The other thing with jet fuel is you can inhale jet fuel and not know that you're inhaling jet fuel. So that jettison that they do in the air is actually, it's not only toxic to humans, it's toxic to animals, and it's also toxic to the earth in general. Trees, plants, the water supply, it spoils the actual earth. So that's not a good thing.
I'm just going to go to the chat real quick because I know we have one here. So we have a question. What are the implications for commercial airline ground crew who are exposed to jet fuel?
It suggests that they are at risk for significant deficits that they're not prepared for and they don't know about.
That makes sense. So I'm going to there's two questions that kind of go together. So people who are on airplanes, such as pilots, like airplane attendants, and also just regular people on a flight. How do they protect themselves, and how does that affect those people as well?
I think they're at risk for exposure because they are, that's their job. So they're doing that a significant amount of time. So they are being exposed. In terms of protecting themselves, I'm not sure how they would protect themselves other than trying to prevent inhaling the fumes. The problem with the fumes is you can be inhaling the fumes and not know that you're inhaling the fumes, because you don't necessarily have to smell it to inhale it. So protection, I think what we really need to do is move away from these type of hydrocarbon fuels and move into the realm of more sustainable fuel sources. That's really what we need to do.
So we have a really good question that might tie into what you just said, and that is, what policies have the military incorporated based on this research?
They have not incorporated any.
Oh.
They have not incorporated anything. In fact, they continue to use fuel, and as far as I can tell, they've done nothing. I do know that since this research has been published, about every 2 months or so since I think 2014, I've been getting emails and phone calls from veterans who are trying to get compensation because they think that they've been exposed to jet fuel and noise, and the combination has affected them in some way. And what they've done is taken the data, the research that we've done, that we've published, to advocate for themselves. So, but other than that, the military hasn't done anything different. I don't think, you know, I think it might be a cost thing, because in order to change fuel, that's a major infrastructure and cost issue, but it's necessary. You know, one veteran said to me that this is our new Agent Orange, and I think he's actually correct. Yeah.
So I have a question for you. So I know your studies were kind of based off of one type of jet fuel. Is there movement to try to do this study with other types of jet fuel to see if that affects anything differently?
So you remember how I measured the chemical composition of the jet fuel?
Yes.
It's the same fuel. So
Okay.
they're all the same fuel. What makes them different are some performance additives. So for instance, the jet fuel that's used in the military and the jet fuel that's used commercially are the same fuel. The only difference between them is the flash point. Flash point means a point at which they will combust. So the military, the fuel that's used in the military has a higher flash point, so it's going to combust at a higher level than commercial. But it's the same fuel. They have the same chemicals that I showed in the beginning there.
Okay, that makes sense. And I also have one more question, but I think that will kind of close off the night. So besides changing into more sustainable and less hydrocarbon fuel, are there any other ways that military personnel or people who are continuously working with noise exposure and jet fuel together can protect themselves? Like, is there any like PPE that they can use or stuff like that to mitigate it at least?
Yeah, so there's engineering controls where we can create engines and other apparatus that produce less noise, but we can also try to wear ear protection as well. The problem is that your standard ear protection may block about 30 dB, but then the noise around you might be 160. So 160 and you take away 30, you're still left with a whopping loud noise exposure. So we need to create a quieter world. That's one way. Definitely wear ear protection, but even with ear protection, you're still going to end up with you could still end up with some level of damage depending on how loud the sound is. And in terms of fuel, we need more sustainable fuel, more fuel that's actually less toxic. What's interesting here is that the military actually changed from JP5 jet fuel to the current fuel, which is JP8, and they changed to JP8 because they thought that was less toxic. Now we have data showing that no, it's not. It's toxic. So I think it's a quagmire. It's a very difficult situation, but if we put our minds to it, I think we can come up with less toxic fuel and a safer environment in terms of noise.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Thank you for answering all of these questions. I think at the moment, we only have one more, but I'm unsure what exactly is being asked. I don't know if there's a typo or something, but it says, how is exposure maybe taken to cause damage? I'm not sure if the person who is asking that question, there we go. How long does exposure take to cause damage? Like, is there a time frame for that?
So in the animal studies, it was 6 weeks. And in the human studies, we had folks who were on the job for weeks, some for months, and some for years. And in all those situations, we found pathological outcomes. So the exact day or length of time we don't know, but it appears that there's no good amount of time to be exposed to both jet fuel and noise.
Okay, that is good to know. Well, I think that kind of wraps up our questions.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much, Claire, for fielding the questions. We really appreciate you. And thank you so much, Dr. Guthrie. We really appreciate your words of wisdom. And this research is very essential to our livelihood, so we really appreciate you being present tonight. I'm going to put in the link for our survey. So please take the time to fill that out. And I'm getting feedback right now, so I'm kind of speaking really slow, trying to think. But I think that is the end of our night tonight. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Guthrie, for being a part of the Flagstaff Festival of Science. And please check out our website, scifest.org, to check out the upcoming events. Okay, so we wish you all a good evening, and we hope you have a good night. We'll see you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.